Guten Abend, good evening, citizens of the free world, wherever you may still be free. If you're receiving this, congratulations, you've found Divided City Dispatch, broadcasting live, or more accurately, broadcasting from behind a very sudden, very inconvenient fence, from the heart of Berlin in the year of our Lord 1961. My name is Klaus Richter, a humble voice on the airwaves, and if the sheer impossible absurdity of this trans-dimensional broadcast, from a moment when concrete replaces courtesy, doesn't compel you to immediately smash that subscribe button and commit to hearing inconvenient truths, then frankly, your apathy is more impenetrable than this new wall. Do it now, before they cut the wires, and tell me, if this peculiar connection holds, from what strange undivided corner of your world are you listening? What year has the Cold War decreed for you, and what time do these desperate tidings reach you? We're taking notes for history. Now, dim your lights, appreciate your open borders, and let's dissect the sudden, very brick-and-mortar reality. Good evening and welcome to Echoes from the Edge, the broadcast that brings you the whispers of history. Tonight we journey back to a city cleaved in two, a place of simmering tension and surreal normalcy. We're in Berlin, the year is 1961, and the air is thick with a suspense you could cut with a knife. This is the story of a city on the precipice, a chapter we call The Divided City, an unsettled piece. 16 years have passed since the guns of the Second World War fell silent. 16 years since the victorious Allies carved this once proud capital into 4 sectors, American, British, French, and Soviet, a quartet of victors, each with their own vision for Germany's future, each with their own agenda. In the West, a beacon of capitalism and democracy was slowly being built from the rubble. In the East, the hammer and compass of Soviet communism were forging a new German state in their image. And caught in the middle, the people of Berlin. Before the 13th of August, life in this divided city was a study in contradictions. Berlin was divided, yes, but more like a house with 2 grumpy tenants. You could still walk from one room to another. The border was a line on a map, a change in the architecture, a different headline on the newspapers, sold at the corner kiosk. West Berliners would cross into the East for a cheap haircut or to visit the state-run opera. East Berliners would venture west for a taste of forbidden fruits, American jazz, Hollywood films, and the dizzying array of consumer goods that filled the shelves of the Kaufhaus des Westerns. This open border was a lifeline, a porous membrane through which flowed not just people but goods, ideas, and secrets. We traded coffee, propaganda, and occasionally family secrets. The S-Bahn and U-Bahn, the city's elevated and underground railways, still crisscrossed the sectors. Their carriages a microcosm of the city itself. A factory worker from the East might sit next to a university student from the West, their brief journey a fleeting moment of shared humanity in a city pulling itself apart. It was a peculiar sort of freedom, a fragile dance on the fault line of the Cold War. The air, however, was never truly still. It crackled with the invisible current of espionage and counter-espionage. Listening posts, manned by agents from both sides, dotted the city. Propaganda posters screamed from every wall, each side trying to win the hearts and minds of the German people. In the West, they promised freedom and prosperity. In the East, they decried the decadence of capitalism and hailed the virtues of the workers' paradise. It was a war of words, a battle for the soul of Berlin, fought with loudspeakers, leaflets, and clandestine radio broadcasts. And what of the families? The families who found themselves on opposite sides of this ideological chasm. A brother in the East, a sister in the West. A Sunday dinner that required a journey across a geopolitical flashpoint. They were the living embodiment of the city's division, their lives a testament to the human cost of this grand political experiment. They navigated the complexities of 2 currencies, 2 political systems, and 2 realities, all within the confines of their own city. Their stories are the threads that weave through the fabric of this unsettled piece. Stories of love, loss, and resilience in the face of a divided world. This constant flow of people, this open wound in the heart of the German Democratic Republic, was a thorn in the side of the East German leadership. Each day, hundreds, sometimes thousands of its citizens, many of them young and skilled, would cast their vote against communism with their feet, disappearing into the welcoming arms of West Berlin. The brain drain, as it came to be known, was unsustainable. The pressure was building, the whispers of a more permanent solution growing louder. A physical barrier, once unthinkable, was now becoming a chillingly real possibility. The summer of 1961 was hot and tense. The world watched, holding its breath. The leaders in Moscow and Washington exchanged terse ultimatums, and in the streets of Berlin a sense of foreboding grew. The unspoken question hung in the air. How long could this last? How long could a city, a nation, a world live on the brink of a chasm? The answer would come on a quiet Sunday in August, an answer of bricks, barbed wire, and broken families, an answer that would change the course of history. If this glimpse into a peculiar and poignant past has captured your imagination, if you wish to hear more stories from the forgotten corners of history, then subscribe to Echoes from the Edge. Join our broadcast as we delve deeper into the moments that shaped our world. Don't let these stories fade into silence. Subscribe now and become a guardian of their echoes. Welcome back to Echoes from the Edge. If you are just joining us, we are broadcasting from a city holding its breath, a city fractured by ideology. This is Berlin, 1961. In our last transmission, we spoke of the city's strange, divided peace. Tonight, we delve deeper into the wound that refused to clot, the slow, steady hemorrhage that threatened to bring an entire nation to its knees. This is the story of a great escape and the desperate measures taken to stop it. This chapter we call The Brain Drain, East to West Exodus. In the carefully constructed lexicon of the German Democratic Republic, it was called Republikflucht, flight from the Republic. The official propaganda painted it as a crime, a betrayal of the socialist fatherland. But for the millions who undertook this journey, it was not a flight of treason, but a pursuit of life. It was a vote cast not in a ballot box, but with their feet. Each departure was a quiet, personal, yet profoundly political act of defiance against the state that claimed to own their future. The scale of this exodus was staggering, a demographic catastrophe in slow motion. Between the founding of the two German states in 1949 and this summer of 1961, more than 2.5 million people had left the East for the West. Imagine a country losing nearly a sixth of its population. This wasn't a trickle of dissidents. It was a deluge of ordinary citizens, a mass migration unparalleled in peacetime Europe. The nation was emptying out, and Berlin was the emergency exit. By the late 1950s, the main border between East and West Germany had been sealed. It was a terrifying gauntlet of fences, watchtowers, and armed guards. But in Berlin, the heart of the conflict, the loophole remained. Here the border was a city street. Freedom was the cost of a subway ticket. One could board an S-Bahn train in communist East Berlin and minutes later step out into the neon-lit, cacophonous freedom of the capitalist West. It was a journey from one reality to another. Who were these people, these Republikfluchtlinge? A disproportionate number were young. More than half of the refugees were under the age of 25. They were the generation that had grown up in the shadow of the war, promised a glorious socialist future, but instead finding a reality of conformity, restriction, and scarcity. They saw the vibrant, chaotic, opportunity-rich life of the West on television, heard it on the radio, and knew it was just a few kilometers away. The GDR was not just losing its citizens, it was losing its future. The loss was not just in numbers, but in quality. As one West Berlin radio commentator wryly noted, every day, thousands simply walked away. Doctors, engineers, even good plumbers. East Germany was bleeding talent faster than I bleed words. It was a brain drain of epic proportions. The GDR had invested heavily in educating its populace, only to see its brightest and most skilled professionals take their state-funded expertise and walk across an open border to serve the economy of their ideological rival. The consequences were tangible and devastating. Hospitals in cities like Leipzig and Dresden reported critical staff shortages as doctors and nurses sought the better pay and advanced equipment of the West. Ambitious state construction projects stalled for a lack of qualified engineers and architects. Factories struggled to meet their quotas, losing their most experienced technicians and managers. The promise of a workers' paradise was crumbling because the workers themselves were leaving. The flight was not limited to the technical professions. It was an exodus of the soul of the nation as well. University professors chafed under rigid political control over their curriculum. Writers and playwrights grew weary of the ever-present state censor, of being told what truths they were and were not allowed to explore in their art. They sought the intellectual freedom of the West, leaving behind a cultural landscape that was growing increasingly sterile and dogmatic. What was the siren song of the Golden West? It was the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that had transformed West Germany from rubble into a powerhouse. It was the lure of the mighty Deutschmark, which could buy cars, televisions, and fashionable clothes. It was the simple, intoxicating promise of choice, the choice of what to study, what career to pursue, where to live, what to say, and what to read. For many, it was the promise of a life lived on one's own terms. Conversely, the push from the East was just as powerful. It was the daily reality of life in a police state, the suffocating presence of the Stasi, the Ministry for State Security, whose web of informants was rumored to be everywhere. It was the forced collectivization of farms in the late 50s, which had alienated the rural population. It was the constant political indoctrination, the mandatory participation in state parades and youth groups, and the gnawing sense that your life was not your own. Imagine being a young engineer in East Berlin. Your career path is chosen for you by the state. You live in a drab apartment block, and your greatest ambition might be to get on a waiting list for a sputtering Trabant car. A few stops on the U-Bahn and you see young men your age driving their own Volkswagens, debating politics freely in cafes, and planning vacations to Italy or France. The contrast was not just stark. For many, it became unbearable. The process of leaving was, for a time, deceptively simple. One would pack a small bag, careful not to arouse the suspicion of neighbors or the authorities. You would tell friends you were visiting a relative in East Berlin, you'd buy your train ticket, take the journey to the city, and then, at a chosen moment, you would walk across a sector border. Your heart would be pounding, every uniformed figure a potential threat, but for thousands every week, the gamble paid off. Their first stop was often the Marienfelder Reception Center in a quiet suburb of West Berlin. It was a sprawling complex of buildings that became a symbol of the Exodus, a sort of Ellis Island of the Cold War. Here, refugees were registered, fed and housed. They were also debriefed by Western intelligence agencies, eager for any information about conditions inside the G. For the newly arrived, Marienfeld was a place of immense relief, endless bureaucracy, and their first tentative taste of Western life. The GDR's official response was a torrent of furious propaganda. They refused to acknowledge the systemic failures that drove their citizens away. Instead, they painted the refugees as moral degenerates, traitors, and criminals. State newspapers ran lurid stories claiming that young people were being lured to the West by spies, seduced by promises of a decadent lifestyle, only to be exploited and forced into crime. It was a desperate attempt to pathologize the act of seeking freedom. We must not forget the profound personal cost of this decision. Fleeing meant leaving everything else behind. It meant saying goodbye to parents, siblings, and friends with no guarantee of ever seeing them again. It meant abandoning your home, your possessions, your memories. It was a radical act of self-amputation, severing ties with your entire world in the desperate hope of grafting yourself onto a new one. It was a choice born not of whimsy, but of desperation. This is why the radio commentator's words resonated so deeply. Something had to give. We just didn't expect it to be our city's face. The constant, debilitating loss of people had created a permanent crisis for the East German regime. The state was not just losing a workforce, it was losing its legitimacy. How could the socialist experiment be declared a success when its own citizens were so desperate to escape it? The leadership was backed into a corner. The economic consequences were cascading. The flight of skilled labor was crippling key industries, making it impossible to meet the goals of the state's rigid 5-year plans. The loss of taxpayers was shrinking the national budget. The agricultural sector, already damaged by collectivization, was further weakened by the flight of farmers. The GDR's economy was spiraling downwards, and the exodus was the engine of its descent. The regime tried to tighten its grip. Controls at the sector borders in Berlin were increased. Plainclothes Stasi officers patrolled the trains. The penalties for Republikflucht were made more severe. But these measures were like trying to patch a bursting dam with tape. For every person they caught, hundreds more slipped through the net. The magnetic pull of the West and the deep disillusionment with the East were forces too powerful to be stopped by simple police measures. By the summer of 1961, the German Democratic Republic was on the verge of total state failure. The exodus had reached a frenzied peak, with daily departures numbering in the thousands. The country was on life support, and its leaders knew that without drastic action, it would not survive. The very existence of the state was now at stake. Walter Ulbricht, the hardline leader of the GDR, made increasingly desperate appeals to his patron in Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev. He argued, correctly, that the socialist dream in Germany was dying, bleeding out through the open vein of Berlin. He insisted that the only solution, the only way to save the country, was to physically seal the border, to amputate the limb to save the body. He needed Moscow's permission to build a wall. Khrushchev faced a perilous choice. To allow the GDR, a key satellite state, to collapse would be a catastrophic defeat in the Cold War, a victory for the West that he could not abide. Yet, to authorize the sealing of Berlin was an act of enormous aggression. It risked a direct military confrontation with the American, British, and French forces stationed in West Berlin. It was a gamble that could potentially trigger a Third World War. The Western Allies were not blind to the crisis. Intelligence reports spoke of the GDR's desperation. There were whispers and rumors of a potential border closure, but the exact nature and timing of such a move were unknown. The official Western policy was firm on one point, guaranteeing access for their forces to West Berlin. The freedom of movement for Germans between the sectors of the city, however, was not covered by any formal treaty. It was a tragic gray area. This uncertainty fueled a final panicked rush for the exits. Throughout July and into the first days of August of 1961, the refugee centers in West Berlin were overwhelmed. The numbers were astronomical. A sense of now or never gripped the populace of the East. The air in Berlin was electric with fear and anticipation. The open door, which had been a feature of life for 16 years, felt as if it were about to slam shut. The point of no return had been reached. In the secretive corridors of the Kremlin, the decision was made. Khrushchev gave Ulbricht the green light. The plan, meticulously prepared by the East Germans under the codename Operation Rose, was to be implemented. After years of pleading, the GDR leadership finally had permission to build its prison. A city, a nation, held its final, shuddering breath. The exodus, this great migration driven by hope and despair, was the disease that had brought the state to the brink of death. The leadership had chosen its cure. It was not reform, not freedom, not prosperity. The cure was concrete, barbed wire, and armed guards. The cure was a wall. The diagnosis was complete, the prognosis dire. East Germany was bleeding out, and its leaders had chosen a tourniquet made of concrete and barbed wire. How does a nation justify imprisoning its own people to save itself? What becomes of those who are trapped behind the wire, their desperate cries for freedom suddenly silenced? Don't let those cries fade into the static of the past. Subscribe to Echoes from the Edge for more tales of human migration, of desperate struggle, and of the unyielding quest for a better life. Subscribe now before the lines go dead. Good evening. You have tuned in to Echoes from the Edge. We have reached the moment of rupture, the point of no return. We are in Berlin, on the threshold of a day that will live in infamy. The night is Saturday, the 12th of August, 1961. A city is breathing its last, unknowing sigh of a peculiar, fractured freedom. What is about to happen will not be announced with sirens or declarations of war. It will arrive in the dead of night with the quiet efficiency of a nightmare. This is the chapter we call That Fateful Sunday. August 13th, 1961. It was a Saturday like any other in the simmering heat of a Berlin summer. In the West, The Kurfürstendamm was alive with people, the cinemas were showing the latest films. In the east, families gathered for their evening meals, perhaps listening to the state-controlled radio. Across the city, in both sectors, goodbyes were said at subway stations and street corners, casual farewells, with the easy assumption of reunion. See you tomorrow. Call me next week. These simple phrases, spoken without a second thought, would soon become monuments to a lost world. But while Berlin slept, the leadership of the German Democratic Republic was wide awake. At a government villa in the north of East Berlin, the final orders for Operation Rose were issued. The plan, coordinated with Moscow, was a masterpiece of secrecy and speed. Orders were dispatched to the National People's Army, the border police, the regular police known as Vopos, and thousands of members of the Kampfgruppen der Arbeiterklasse, the paramilitary factory combat groups. The objective was absolute, to seal the border with West Berlin completely, and to do it before the city awoke. The code for the operation to commence was almost poetic in its mundane cruelty. Wallflower. At precisely 1 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, August 13th, the signal was given. Across East Germany, a vast, repressive machine lurched into motion. There was no turning back. The fate of millions was being decided by a handful of men, while the subjects of their decree slept, blissfully unaware. The first signs of the operation were auditory, the low, ominous rumble of engines in the quiet, pre-dawn hours. Convoys of military trucks, their headlights cutting through the darkness, began to move from barracks on the city's outskirts. They were filled with grim-faced soldiers, concrete posts, and immense spools of barbed wire. They converged silently on the 81 street crossings and the numerous other points along the 27-mile border that snaked through the city's heart. The first act of division was surgical and swift. The city's circulatory system was severed. At 1:30 in the morning, the S-Bahn and U-Bahn trains that ran between the sectors were halted at the border. Passengers were ordered off, confused and alarmed. Simultaneously, telephone lines between East and West Berlin were cut. The city was being rendered deaf and dumb, its two halves isolated from one another before the physical separation had even truly begun. Then came the wire. Under the dim orange glow of streetlights, at iconic locations like the Brandenburg Gate and Potsdamer Platz, and on anonymous neighborhood streets, the work began. Soldiers and workers with practiced efficiency began to hammer thick wooden posts into the ground. They tore up the cobblestones of streets that had connected communities for centuries. And then they started to unspool the wire. The first, thin, spidery lines of the Iron Curtain were being drawn not on a map, but in the very soil of Berlin. Dawn broke on a quiet Sunday. The first rays of sun illuminated a city that was, unbeknownst to most of its inhabitants, fundamentally and irrevocably changed. The church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to morning service. People in dressing gowns emerged from their apartment buildings to fetch fresh bread rolls from the corner bakeries. It was, for a few fleeting moments, a perfectly normal Sunday morning. The discovery came in stages, in thousands of individual moments of disbelief. A woman looking out her kitchen window, expecting to see her neighbor's house, instead sees a line of young soldiers holding rifles. A man stepping out of his front door finds his path blocked by a makeshift barricade and a tangle of wire. The initial reaction was not anger, but profound confusion. Was this a military exercise? A movie scene? The mind simply refused to process the reality of what the eyes were seeing. This is the moment a local journalist later described with a chilling simplicity. It was a Sunday, quiet. Then, before the coffee was cold, they were there. Soldiers, barbed wire. Suddenly a street wasn't a street, it was a border. The suddenness was the most brutal part of the assault. There had been no warning, no ultimatum. The city had gone to sleep in one state and woken up in another. The rules of existence had changed overnight. And then came the sound of the silence. As the journalist recalled, the silence was louder than any explosion. As people began to gather on both sides of the new, crude barrier, a stunned, eerie quiet descended. There were no grand protests at first, no revolutionary cries. There was only the collective silent stare of thousands of people, gazing in horror at the armed men and the glistening wire that now stood where their lives used to be. It was the sound of a city in a state of profound shock. The scenes that played out along that line were heartbreaking in their domestic tragedy. A man in his pajamas stood on the western side, shouting to a baker on the eastern side, unable to buy the bread he had bought every Sunday for 30 years. Children waved from a street corner in the east to their playmates just 50 yards away in the west, now unreachable. The thousands of Grenzgänger, the border-crossing workers, arrived in their Sunday best for their shifts in the west, only to be met by a line of bayonets and told to go home. The barrier was not just wire and posts, it was made of human beings. The soldiers of the National People's Army, many of them barely out of their teens, stood as human walls. They were Germans, ordered to point their guns at other Germans. You could see the tension etched on their faces, a mixture of fear, indoctrination, and the dawning horror of their task as they faced the pleading, tear-streaked faces of their own countrymen. The reaction from the authorities in the West was one of equal confusion. West Berlin police officers and the Allied military patrols who came to observe were in a state of disbelief. Their orders were clear: to observe and report, but not to intervene. To challenge the East German troops could be the spark that ignited a Third World War. They could only stand and watch as the cage was built around their city's other half. Willy Brandt, the dynamic and passionate mayor of West Berlin, was awoken from a campaign trip and rushed back to the city. His voice, broadcast over the radio, was filled with outrage. He condemned the illegal and inhuman action of the GDR. Yet he also had to plead for calm. He knew that any violent protest from the West could be used as a pretext for an even greater crackdown by the Soviets. The news flashed across the world via telegraph and radio. Berlin, the perennial flashpoint, was the center of global attention. In Washington, in London, in Paris, leaders scrambled for information. What was Khrushchev's ultimate goal? Was this a prelude to an invasion of West Berlin? The world held its breath, waiting for the American response, waiting to see if this act of aggression would be met with force. But for the Berliners, the crisis was not geopolitical, it was deeply, agonizingly personal. The finality of the situation began to dawn. The brother who had stayed late at a party in the West and now could not return to his family in the East. The nurse who could no longer get to her hospital. The grandparents who had waved goodbye to their grandchildren the day before, now realizing they were separated by an impenetrable barrier. A temporary measure, they hoped, but a terrifying fear began to grow that it was not. The barbed wire was only the beginning. It was a hastily erected fence, but it was phase 1. Within days, the next phase of Operation Rose began. Convoys of trucks started delivering concrete posts, cinder blocks, and bags of cement. The first crude, gray, ugly sections of a solid wall started to rise, replacing the wire. The provisional was becoming permanent. Nowhere was this tragedy more visceral than on the Bernauer Strasse. Here, the apartment buildings on one side of the street were in the east, but the pavement and street itself were in the west. As the wall began to rise, residents began to take desperate measures. They threw their belongings and then themselves out of their windows, jumping into blankets held open by the West Berlin Fire Brigade and crowds of onlookers. It was a flight to freedom measured in a few terrifying seconds. The regime in the East was methodical in its cruelty. Every crack, every loophole was sealed. The grand entrances to U-Bahn stations in the East that served Western lines were bricked up, turning them into ghost stations that Western trains would pass through for decades to come. Cemeteries, parks, even rivers were bisected by the barrier. Nothing was to be left to chance. The prison had to be perfect. Amidst the shock, the first embers of defiance began to glow. West Berliners would gather at the wall, shouting insults and news headlines to the people on the other side. East German guards would be subjected to a constant barrage of taunts. Small, symbolic acts of resistance provided a sliver of hope in the face of overwhelming force. But the cost was becoming terrifyingly real. On August 22nd, a 58-year-old woman named Ida Siegmann, attempting to jump from her third-floor apartment on the Bernauer Strasse, missed the blanket and died on the pavement below. She became one of the first of hundreds who would die at the Berlin Wall. The barrier had claimed its first life. The abstract political act now had a face, a name, and a tragic end. And the world's response? After days of tense silence, it became clear the West would not intervene with force. President Kennedy, while publicly condemning the wall, privately concluded that it was a solution, albeit a grim one, to the crisis of refugees that had threatened to destabilize all of Europe. As Khrushchev reportedly said, a wall was a hell of a lot better than a war. The message was clear. The safety of West Berlin was guaranteed, but East Berlin had been sacrificed. The initial paralyzing shock slowly gave way to a grim, horrifying new reality. The wall was not coming down next week or next month. It was a permanent scar, a concrete monstrosity designed to last. The city was no longer just divided by ideology. Half of it was now a physical prison. The GDR had given its creation a cynical name, the anti-fascist protection rampart. To the rest of the world, it would only ever be known as the Berlin Wall. The coffee went cold on that August morning. The Sunday quiet was shattered forever. A line of wire became a wall of concrete, and a city of nearly 4 million people became the world's most visible prison. How does a population adapt to such a brutal, instantaneous reality? What happens to the human spirit when hope is extinguished overnight? The story of the wall is not just one of concrete. It is a story of courage, despair, and the enduring will to be free. If you are still processing this sudden, shocking historical shift, then you absolutely must subscribe. Don't let the memory of that brutal Sunday be sealed away by time. Subscribe to Echoes from the Edge and help us keep these stories alive. Good evening. This is Echoes from the Edge, your signal from a city under construction, a terrible, monstrous construction. It has been days since the 13th of August, days that have felt like years. The initial shock of that fateful Sunday has curdled into a new, grinding horror. The barbed wire was a wound, yes, but a wound we thought might heal. Now we see the stitches are being made of concrete. Tonight we bear witness to the physical manifestation of our division. This is the chapter we call Bricks and Barbed Wire, the Physical Scars. The barbed wire came first. It was a vicious, jagged sketch of a border, unspooled in panic and haste through the heart of our city. For the first few days it was almost surreal. It was ugly, yes, a tangle of thorns tearing through our familiar streets. But it seemed porous, flimsy even. One could still see through it, talk through it, pass small items through its gaps. It was a barrier, but it still allowed for the illusion of connection, however fraught with danger. In those first days, Berliners would gather at the wire, drawn by a morbid curiosity and a desperate need to connect. Families would stand on opposite sides, shouting messages of love and reassurance. Friends would arrange to meet, separated by the wire, but united in their disbelief. The wire was a physical object, but the true barrier was the line of grim-faced young guards, the Vopus, and soldiers ordered to enforce this new reality. They were the true wall. These guards, many of them looking as bewildered as the citizens they were facing, gave the flimsy wire its terrible authority. Their presence transformed a simple fence into the frontier of a prison. Their rifles, held at the ready, were a constant, silent threat. They were the human component of this cruel equation, the living embodiment of the state's will to divide, to sever, to control. A colleague of mine, watching the scene unfold on the Bernauer Strasse, put it starkly. The wire came first, he said, his voice low. It was the initial insult, the quick slash of the knife. He was right. The wire was the declaration of intent, the brutal opening statement in a conversation no one wanted to have, but it was what came next that truly began to extinguish the last embers of hope for a swift resolution. That hope began to die with the arrival of the trucks, not the military trucks that brought the soldiers, but heavy civilian construction lorries. They didn't carry more wire. They rumbled onto the scene laden with sand, with gravel, with mountains of grey cinder blocks and pallets of reddish-brown bricks. They brought bags upon bags of cement. The sound of their diesel engines was a death knell for the idea that this was a temporary measure. The sight of these materials confirmed our worst fears. This was not a temporary police action. This was an act of construction, an act of permanence. The scraping sound of shovels, the splash of water into cement mixers, these were the sounds of our city's open wound being crudely, brutally stitched shut, not with thread but with stone. The hope for a reversal of this nightmare was being buried under tons of building supplies. And then, as my colleague predicted, the work began in earnest. Then the bricks, he said, his broadcast now a running commentary of our collective horror. Quickly, relentlessly, they built a wall through our city, through our lives, with the speed of a very efficient, very cruel machine. His words captured the terrifying velocity of it all. This wasn't the slow, considered pace of civic improvement. This was the frantic, urgent pace of prison construction. The East German regime gave their creation a name of breathtaking cynicism. The anti-fascistische Schutzwall, the anti-fascist protection rampart. A rampart to protect whom from what? We looked at the guards, their guns pointed inward, toward their own citizens, and we knew. This was no rampart against fascism. This was a cage, and the state was the zookeeper, branding its own people as the animals that needed to be contained. Who were the men building this monstrosity? They were construction workers, masons, members of the Kampf group and factory militias, all pressed into this grim service. Some worked with a chilling ideological fervor, believing the propaganda. Others worked with the dull mechanical rhythm of men who knew better than to question their orders. Their faces were often blank, their movements swift, as they laid the foundation for our collective prison. The speed was horrifying. All along the 27-mile gash through the city, the wall rose. It was not a single continuous effort, but 100 small construction projects happening at once. A section here, a section there. A street corner blocked, then a park bisected, then a cemetery cut in two. Every hour another gap was plugged. The sounds of their work, the scrape of the trowel, the wet slap of mortar, the solid thud of brick on brick, became the new, sickening soundtrack of Berlin. The most visceral horror was reserved for the buildings that stood directly on the new border. On streets like the aforementioned Bernauerstrasse, where the apartment doorways opened into the east, but their windows faced west, the cruelty was absolute. Workers on scaffolds would appear, and methodically, window by window, they would brick up the openings. They were sealing people's homes, turning their views of a city into solid walls of grey. They were burying them alive in their own apartments. The first generation of the wall was not the smooth, graffiti-covered monolith it might one day become. It was a raw, ugly, brutalist thing, a jagged, uneven scar made of whatever was at hand. Cinder blocks of different sizes, old bricks salvaged from rubble, hastily poured concrete sections. It was a patchwork of division, its very crudeness a testament to the speed and violence of its creation. It was a wall built in a panicked rage. This is when my colleague added the final, terrible observation, a truth that chilled us all to the bone. "It's not just concrete, you know," he broadcasted, his voice cracking with emotion. "It's concrete malice." And that is what we were seeing. Every brick was laid with intent. Every bag of cement was mixed with a purpose, to separate, to isolate, to punish. The wall was not an inanimate object. It was an active instrument of state-sponsored cruelty. Seeing this permanent structure rise had a profound psychological effect. The shock of the 13th of August gave way to a deep, gnawing despair. The finality of it was crushing. It ended the wait-and-see attitude. It ended the hope that the Western powers would intervene. It ended the illusion that this was all just a terrible, temporary misunderstanding. The wall was real, it was growing, and it was here to stay. And behind the wall, an even more sinister creation was taking shape. As the main barrier went up, a second, parallel fence began to appear, 100 yards deeper into East Berlin. In the space between, buildings were being demolished, the ground was being cleared and raked with sand to show footprints. They were creating a no-man's land, a kill zone. This death strip was designed for one purpose, to make escape impossible. Our city, a place of history, of culture, of life, was being grotesquely disfigured. Streets that were once arteries of commerce and community now ran into a dead end of concrete. Vistas that had been enjoyed for generations, views of churches, of parks, of the Brandenburg Gate, were now obliterated by a blank, grey canvas of oppression. The physical map of Berlin was being violently and irrevocably redrawn. The Allied response, or lack thereof, cemented this new reality. Protests were lodged, speeches were made, but the tanks did not roll. The West, it became clear, would protect its own sectors, but it would not go to war to tear down the wall. For those of us here, and especially for those trapped on the other side, it felt like a profound abandonment. We were on our own, staring at the monster being built in our backyard. A new, grim normal began to set in. Life, as it always does, had to go on, but now it went on with the wall as a constant, malevolent presence. Commutes were rerouted, views from windows were forever changed. The daily routine now included the sight of this ever-growing, ever-present scar. It became a monstrous feature of the landscape, as mundane and as horrifying as a permanent funeral pyre at the end of your street. The wall became a character in every Berliner's story. It was a silent, watching observer, a constant reminder of what was lost. It cast a literal and metaphorical shadow over the entire city. It was the uninvited guest at every meal, the silent participant in every conversation. It was the physical manifestation of the anxiety and fear that now defined our lives. And the machine never stopped refining its cruelty. The work was constant. Once a section of wall was built, they would improve it. They would add bits of broken glass to the top, or another roll of barbed wire. They were constantly thinking of new ways to make it more impassable, more deadly. The wall was not just a static object. It was a constantly evolving system of control. The physical scars on our city are deep and ugly, but they are only an outward reflection of the scars being carved into the hearts of its people. The families torn apart by the wire are now separated by a barrier of stone. The whispered hope of reunion has been replaced by the deafening silence of concrete. The brokenness is no longer just a concept. It is a 12-foot-high reality. The soundscape of the city has changed. The familiar noises from the other side, the church bells, the traffic, the distant laughter, are gone, muffled by the wall. They have been replaced by the sounds of construction, the shouts of the guards, and the unnerving quiet of the death strip. It is the sound of a city holding its breath, perhaps indefinitely. From here, in the autumn of 1961, the future looks bleak. The wall stands as a testament to the failure of politics, of humanity. One must wonder, how long can such a monstrous thing last? Years? Decades? Will we grow old with this scar? The uncertainty is its own form of torture, another brick in the wall of our despair. The bricks are being laid as we speak. The concrete is still wet in some places. The malice is hardening into a permanent feature of our world. We are here to bear witness, to document every stone, every strand of wire. But we need you to listen, support our very tangible observations. Hit that subscribe button before the next brick is laid. Don't let our broadcast be silenced. Don't let the story of this wall be buried in concrete. Subscribe now. Good evening. You are listening to Echoes from the Edge, your broadcast from the heart of a freshly wounded city. In our previous transmissions, we have spoken of the politics that divide us, the wire that ensnares us, and the bricks that entomb us. But these are cold, hard things. Tonight we must speak of what is soft, what bleeds, what breaks. We must speak of the human heart, of the family, an institution now being systematically dismantled by concrete and ideology. This is the chapter we must call Broken Families, the Human Cost of Division. The morning of Sunday the 13th of August dawned not just on a new political reality, but on a million personal catastrophes. The shock was not of a headline read in a newspaper. It was the shock of a bedroom door that would not open, a path home that no longer existed. The casual goodbye spoken on Saturday night, the promise to see a mother or a brother the next day, had become, in the space of a few hours, a lie, a final, unknowing farewell. Across the city, a unique and terrible demographic was created overnight: the Wall children. These were the boys and girls who had been visiting their grandparents for the weekend in a different sector, the children who had gone for a sleepover at a friend's house just a few streets away. They awoke on Sunday morning not just in a different part of the city, but in what was now effectively a different country, trapped and terrified, with no way to get home to their parents. The severing cut through the most intimate of bonds. Husbands and wives were caught on opposite sides. A man goes to his night shift in a factory in the West and cannot return to his wife and children in the East. A woman attends the theater with a friend in the East and cannot get back to her apartment and her husband in the West. The sacred vows of marriage, to have and to hold, were rendered meaningless by a line of soldiers and a roll of barbed wire. I see this agony everywhere. It has become the very fabric of our new existence. A colleague shared a story with me just yesterday, his voice hollow with disbelief. "My neighbor," he said, "his sister lives across the street. Literally, he can see her living room window from his. She waved this morning from her window. He waved back from his. Now there's a wall going up, a concrete wall, between their living rooms." He just shook his head and walked away. My colleague's final words to me before he left have haunted me. "It's a cruelty," he muttered, "that only bureaucrats could invent." And that is the sickening truth of it. This is not the passionate, chaotic destruction of a hot war. This is a cold, calculated administrative act, a decision made in a sterile room, put down on paper as Operation Rose, and executed with chilling efficiency, with no thought given to the intricate web of human connection it would shred to pieces. In these early weeks, the most potent form of torture is visual. It is the agony of proximity without access. From windows in the West, you can see your loved ones in the East, you can wave, you can hold up signs, they can see you, but you cannot touch, you cannot hold, you cannot comfort. The small patch of land between you, this new death strip, might as well be the widest ocean on Earth. It is a psychological torment of the highest order. And then there is the silence. In the first hours, the East German state cut the telephone lines between East and West Berlin. That sudden dead quiet on the line was a profound symbol of what was to come. The inability to even hear a loved one's voice, to offer a word of comfort or to hear one in return, created a vacuum filled only with fear and speculation. The enforced silence between families was as cruel as the physical wall itself. In the first few days, there were desperate, futile attempts to breach the new divide. People flocked to the nascent border, pleading with the young guards. They showed them photographs of their children, their spouses. They held up wedding rings, identity papers, anything to prove their connection, to appeal to a shared humanity. But the guards, under the watchful eyes of their officers, remained impassive, their faces masks of indoctrination. The answer was always no. The Bernaustrasse became a focal point for this human drama, a theater of despair. We all saw the images. We saw the families in the east-facing apartments making the desperate decision to flee. We saw them lowering their children down on ropes into the waiting arms of strangers, and the West Berlin fire brigade below. Every successful jump was a victory, but every cry of encouragement from the street was laced with the agony of the families who could not or dared not make the leap. Consider the fate of the 50,000 Grenzgänger, the border crossers who lived in the East but worked in the West. On Saturday they were breadwinners, on Sunday they were exiles. They were faced with an impossible choice, delivered by a wall. Do you abandon your family in the East to keep your livelihood in the West? Or do you return to the East, to your loved ones, but also to unemployment and the suspicion of the state? It was a choice with no right answer. The cruelty of the wall fell with particular weight upon the elderly. Across Berlin, thousands of grandparents were suddenly cut off from their children and grandchildren, who were often their primary source of support, both emotional and physical. They were left to face their final years in isolation, haunted by the fear of falling ill, of dying alone, without the comfort of their family by their side. Their loneliness is one of the deepest, quietest tragedies of this division. The wall shattered the simple, profound rituals that hold a family together. The Sunday dinners at Omar's house, the celebration of a child's birthday, the gathering for a wedding, the shared grief of a funeral. All of it gone. The very fabric of family life is woven from these shared moments. The wall took a knife to that fabric, leaving behind irreparable tears and gaping holes, where life's most important milestones should be. In the absence of physical contact and telephone calls, the humble letter has become a precious, fragile lifeline. People write frantic, censored letters, hoping they will make it through the postal service, knowing they will likely be read by the Stasi. Every word must be weighed. How do you convey your love and your terror without endangering the recipient? The family letter, once a thing of simple joy, has become a document of fraught and dangerous communication. The East German state, in its infinite cruelty, has even tried to poison these broken bonds. Their propaganda machine works relentlessly, telling its trapped citizens that their families in the West have now been corrupted, that they are part of a hostile, decadent world. It is a disgusting attempt to replace the love of family with the ideology of the state, to convince people that the bonds of blood are less important than the demands of the party. Here in the West, a sense of helpless frustration has set in. Viewing platforms have been erected, crude wooden structures where people can climb a few feet to try and catch a glimpse of the other side. They have been nicknamed scaffolds of shame. People stand there for hours, peering through binoculars, hoping to see a familiar face in a distant window. It is a testament to both love and powerlessness. The psychological toll of this enforced separation is already becoming apparent. Doctors are beginning to speak of Mauer Krankheit, or wall sickness. It is a condition of depression, anxiety, and claustrophobia brought on by the sudden imprisonment and the severing of family ties. The stress of the situation is a constant, low-grade fever that infects every aspect of daily life. As the weeks turn into months, a new phase of cruelty begins. The wall grows higher, more solid. The last gaps are sealed. The crude cinder blocks are being replaced with smoother, more permanent concrete slabs. The opportunities for even visual contact are disappearing. The ability to wave at a loved one from a window across the street is being systematically erased as the barrier becomes an opaque, unyielding monster. There are whispers, faint rumors, of negotiations for some kind of pass system to allow for visits on holidays, but from here, in the autumn of 1961, that seems like a fantastical dream. For now, and for the foreseeable future, the closure is absolute. The hope of an embrace, of a shared meal, of a simple conversation face-to-face is a luxury that no longer exists for hundreds of thousands of Berliners. A new generation is now being defined by this wall. Cousins who were meant to grow up together will now be strangers. Children will know their aunts, uncles, and grandparents only as names in a letter, as faded figures in a photograph taken in another lifetime, a time before the wall. The state is not only dividing territory, it is creating a generation of familial ghosts. For so many, the wall has ceased to be a mere political symbol. It has become a personal one. It is the tombstone for a living relationship. It is the physical manifestation of their loss, the monument to their broken family. Every time they look at it, they do not see a border between East and West. They see the thing that stands between them and their child, their parent, their spouse. We see small, heartbreaking gestures of remembrance. A woman comes to the western side of the wall on a Tuesday. She tells a reporter it is her son's 7th birthday. She cannot give him a gift, so she leaves a small bouquet of flowers at the foot of the concrete, a gesture of love aimed at an unseen recipient in a world just a few hundred feet away. Out of this shared trauma, this collective heartbreak, something new is being forged, a shared identity, a bond between Berliners, united in their defiance of this cruelty. The story of the broken family is not just one family's story, it is the story of our city. It is the narrative that unites us in our sorrow and our anger. And so we are left with the enduring, agonizing question, how can a family, a city, a nation survive this? The raw, open wound that was torn open on August 13th is not healing. It is being institutionalized in concrete, and the families of Berlin are the ones who must bear the pain of this scar every single day. These aren't just stories we are telling you, they are the lived realities of our neighbors, our friends. They are the frantic, skipped heartbeats of a city in constant pain. To truly understand the cost of this wall, you must look past the politics and see the human tragedies at its foundation. Help us document them. Help us ensure their voices are not silenced by the concrete. Help us understand. Subscribe now. Good evening. You are listening to Echoes from the Edge, broadcasting from a city where the laws of physics are being tested against the laws of tyranny. We have spoken of the wall as a line on a map made real, a brutal scar of concrete and wire. But for a brief, terrifying period, the front line of the Cold War was not a line on the ground, but a vertical space. It was the space between a windowsill and the pavement below. Tonight we look up the last desperate portals to freedom. This is the chapter we call The Desperate Leaps, Windows of Opportunity. In the chaotic aftermath of the 13th of August, a strange and terrible geography asserted itself. There were streets in this city, like the now infamous Bernauerstrasse, where a bizarre jurisdictional quirk existed. The apartment buildings themselves, their doors, their hallways, their staircases, were in the socialist east, but the pavement, the sidewalk, directly below their windows, was in the democratic west. These buildings, once unremarkable tenements, had become the accidental front line in a war of escape. The windows of these buildings were transformed. They ceased to be openings for light and air. They became something else entirely. They became potential escape hatches, loopholes in a system designed to be hermetically sealed. For the people trapped inside those apartments, their own living room windows became the final, terrifying windows of opportunity, a last gasp chance at a life of freedom, just a few stories below. The first jumps were likely acts of pure, unadulterated panic. In the first days, as the wire went up and the guards took their positions, the residents of these border houses must have felt the walls closing in, quite literally. The realization that their front door now led to a prison, but their window led to the west, must have been a dizzying, terrifying revelation. And so they began to leap. A West Berlin police officer, his face etched with a mixture of horror and awe, described the scene to one of our reporters. The apartment buildings facing the west, he said, gesturing with a weary hand, they became escape routes. It was as simple and as profound as that. The very architecture of domestic life, the family home, had been weaponized by the desperate, turned into the last resort for those with everything to lose. The view from the western side was a spectacle of human drama that no playwright could ever conceive. Crowds of West Berliners would gather, their faces turned upward, a collective gasp rising every time a figure appeared in a window. Soon the West Berlin Fire Brigade was a constant presence, their large canvas jumping sheets, the Sprungtoucher, held aloft by a desperate soul and the hard pavement of freedom. Imagine the calculus of that moment. You are standing in your apartment, the home you have known for years. Below, you see the faces of strangers, shouting encouragement. Behind you, you hear the heavy footsteps of the Vopos, the East German police, storming up the stairs to drag you away. You have seconds to decide. The terror of the fall versus the terror of a life without liberty. It is a choice that defies all logic, driven by the most powerful human instinct, to be free. And so they jumped. As the police officer said, people jumping from windows, hoping the nets were there. It was an act of pure, desperate faith. Faith in the strength of a canvas sheet, faith in the arms of strangers, faith that the world they were leaping into was worth the risk of leaving the old one in such a violent, definitive way. They threw their belongings first, a small bag, a coat, and then they threw themselves. The crowd below was not a passive audience. They became active participants in these rescues. They would shout up, "Springsy! Springsy! Jump! Jump!" Their voices a chorus of encouragement, a human lifeline of sound. They would point out the positions of the East German guards, trying to give the potential leaper a precious few extra seconds. It was a spontaneous, chaotic collaboration between the trapped and the free. The escapes became a frantic race against time. As soon as a figure appeared in a window, the Vopos would be alerted. They would use battering rams to break down the apartment doors. The scenes were frantic. People were often dragged away from the windows just as they were about to jump. The struggle was not just against gravity, it was against the grasping hands of the state, reaching to pull them back into the cage. In some of the most heart-wrenching scenes, we saw parents saving their children first. They would fashion ropes from knotted bedsheets, lowering their infants and small children into the waiting nets below, before making the terrifying leap themselves. It was the ultimate act of parental sacrifice and trust, entrusting the life of your child to the hands of strangers in a different world, moments before you followed them into the unknown. But the reality of these escapes was brutal. Some made it, the officer admitted, his gaze falling to the ground. Some landed hard. Even a successful jump into a net could result in broken bones, sprains, severe bruising. The impact was violent. People would be carried away on stretchers, free, but in agony. The price of liberty was paid in physical pain. Then, on the 22nd of August, the theoretical risk became a fatal reality. A 58-year-old widow named Ida Siegmann jumped from her third-floor apartment on Bernauer Strasse. She missed the fire brigade's net. Her death on the pavement of the West transformed this desperate spectacle into a profound tragedy. The wall had claimed one of its first victims, not by a bullet, but by the sheer force of its own cruel gravity. The officer's final words on the matter summed it up with a poet's sad precision. "Freedom is not always graceful," he said. And he was right. There was nothing graceful about these escapes. They were messy, painful, terrifying, and undignified. They were the raw, stripped-down essence of human desperation, a primal scream made visible against the backdrop of brick and mortar. We must pay tribute to the quiet heroes of this chapter, the men of the West Berlin Fire Brigade. Day after day they stood on that street, their arms aching, their necks craned, their nerves frayed. They were the difference between life and death. They were the calm center of a whirlwind of panic, their red trucks a symbol of hope, their canvas sheets a tangible promise of a soft landing in a new life. The soundscape of these streets was a symphony of terror, the sharp, percussive shatter of a window pane being broken, the high-pitched screams of fear and desperation from the jumpers, the deep-throated roar of the crowd below, the wail of ambulance sirens, a constant accompaniment to the drama unfolding stories above. It was the sound of history happening in real, terrifying time. And the world was watching. Photographers and television crews from across the globe flocked to streets like Bernauer Strasse. The images they captured of people in mid-air, of children dangling from ropes, of the grieving crowds, became iconic. They were published in newspapers from New York to Tokyo. This small street in Berlin had become a global stage, exposing the cruelty of the war for all the world to see. The East German regime, of course, could not tolerate this public display of their failure. These escapes were a profound embarrassment, a constant, visible refutation of their claim to be a workers' paradise. A decision was made. These last windows of opportunity had to be slammed shut, permanently. The process was as swift as it was brutal. The remaining residents of these border houses were given eviction notices, sometimes with only a few hours to pack a lifetime of belongings. They were forcibly relocated to other apartments deeper within East Berlin, their homes sacrificed for the security of the state. Their protests were met with threats and intimidation. And then came the Masons, the final brutal act in this drama. The windows were not just locked or boarded up, they were bricked over. One by one, the light-filled portals to the west were systematically filled with grey bricks and wet mortar. The windows of opportunity were being sealed, transformed into blank, blind patches on the face of the buildings. A new, eerie silence descended upon Bernauer Strasse. Where there had once been screams and shouts, there was now only the quiet scrape of the trowel. The buildings themselves, once alive with drama, became hollow shells, blind and silent sentinels guarding the wall. The street became a graveyard of desperate hopes. The closing of the windows marked the end of the first, chaotic era of escape. It was a sign that the wall was evolving, becoming more sophisticated, more perfect in its ability to contain its population. The regime was learning, adapting, and making its prison ever more inescapable. But the legacy of the jumpers endures. Though their escape routes are now sealed with brick, Their stories have become the first legends of the Wall era. Their desperate courage, their leaps of faith, have become a powerful symbol of the indomitable human will to be free. They proved that no wall could ever be built high enough to extinguish that spirit. Their actions have forced a change in thinking. If you can no longer go over the wall, then another way must be found. The era of the desperate leaps is ending. But a new era, one of a different kind of courage and ingenuity, is just beginning. People are already looking down at the soft earth beneath their feet. The era of the tunnels is coming. The raw courage, the terrible risk. It's a story that grabs you by the collar and doesn't let go. If you're finding this delightfully tense, if you feel the weight of history in your bones as you listen, then you know what you must do. The story of this city is still unfolding, brick by brick, tragedy by tragedy. Smash that subscribe button now. Don't let these stories fall into the silence between the brick. Good evening. You are tuned to Echoes from the Edge. We have stood on the western side of the wall, a place of anger, defiance, and a bewildered sense of freedom. But tonight, our broadcast crosses the barrier, not in body, but in spirit. We turn our attention to the other side, to the millions for whom the wall is not a spectacle to be observed, but a cage in which they are now locked. We venture into the silence, into the shadow of the wall that falls eastward. This chapter we call The Trapped and Watched, Life in the East's Shadow. For those in West Berlin, the 13th of August was a day of shock and outrage. For those in East Berlin, it was the day the sky fell in. The finality of it was absolute. For 12 years, the open sector border had been a psychological safety valve, a tangible escape route if life became unbearable. In a single night, that valve was sealed shut. The city, which had been a difficult but manageable home, instantly became a prison. This wasn't a prison with distant walls. The barrier was woven into the fabric of daily life. A trip to the market might now involve walking along a concrete wall topped with glass. The view from your office might now be of a watchtower. The state, in its brutal efficiency, did not just build a wall around West Berlin. It built a cage around every single resident of the East, a constant, physical reminder of their confinement. The immediate aftermath was a city holding its breath, waiting for a reprieve that would never come. The East German state, however, began its campaign of relentless propaganda. The anti-faschistische Schutzwall, the anti-fascist protection rampart, was hailed as a victory for peace, a necessary measure to stop spies and saboteurs from the decadent West. Banners proclaiming this great victory were hung from buildings, their bright red slogans a stark, insulting contrast to the grey mood of the people below. A journalist who managed to get a message to us from the other side described the change in the atmosphere with chilling clarity. In the East, his message read, "The silence is deafening now. It is not the silence of peace or contentment. It is the heavy, oppressive silence of fear. The boisterous, grumbling, opinionated spirit of the Berliner has been muted, replaced by a pervasive, anxious quiet." This fear has a physical manifestation. You can see it in the way people carry themselves. People walk slower, our contact observed. They look at their shoes. There is a notable absence of eye contact on the streets, a reluctance to engage with strangers. A city of millions has adopted the posture of a man trying not to be noticed, a collective hunching of the shoulders against the cold gaze of the state. With the physical escape route closed, the regime's focus shifted inward, to eliminate the possibility of mental or spiritual escape. The primary tool for this internal war is the Ministry for State Security, known to all in a fearful whisper as the Stasi. The wall was their greatest victory. With the population now a captive audience, the Stasi's power swelled to terrifying, omnipresent proportion. And so a new rule of survival has been etched into the consciousness of every East Berliner. It is a lesson learned without ever being formally taught. "You don't speak your mind," the message from our contact continued. "You don't even think too loudly." A stray comment, a frustrated remark about the quality of the bread, a cynical joke about a party official. Any of these can now have catastrophic consequences. Self-censorship has become the most essential survival skill. This internal vigilance is necessary because of the Stasi's most insidious weapon, the inofficielle Mitglieder, or unofficial collaborators, the IMs. The state has perfected the art of turning neighbor against neighbor, colleague against colleague, friend against friend. That friendly man who runs the corner shop, the quiet woman in the apartment downstairs, even a member of your own family, any one of them could be filing a report on your activities, on your words, on your perceived loyalty. Imagine the simple act of going to a pub for a beer. Before August, a grumbled complaint about the party was common. Now that same complaint, uttered in the same pub, is a gamble. Who is sitting at the next table? Is the bartender listening? The social fabric of trust, which holds any community together, is being deliberately and systematically poisoned with paranoia. This is the reality behind the chilling phrase that has become a new unspoken proverb here, "The walls have ears." It is a literal and metaphorical truth. The state is listening, through its network of informants, through bugs planted in apartments, through taps on telephone lines. Every space, public and private, is potentially compromised. The concept of a private conversation, of a sanctuary within your own home, has been effectively abolished. The paranoia seeps into the most sacred of spaces, the family. How can you complain about the regime to your brother-in-law when you know his boss is a zealous party member? Can you trust your own cousin, who seems a little too eager to defend the government's actions? The Stasi's web of informants created fissures within families, forcing people to build walls of silence even with their loved ones. Life behind the wall is also a descent into a world of grey. Grey is the color of the unpainted concrete of the wall itself, the color of the ubiquitous sputtering Trabant cars, the color of the poorly made textiles in the state-run shops. With the vibrant, chaotic, consumer-rich world of the West now completely cut off, the economic shortages and drab uniformity of the planned economy have become more pronounced, more inescapable. With no escape, the state has doubled down on its ideological mission. In schools, children are taught that the wall is a heroic act of peace. In the workplace, participation in political rallies is mandatory. Membership in the Free German Youth, the state's youth organization, is no longer just encouraged. It is the only path to higher education or a good career. The pressure to conform is relentless and total. And if you refuse to conform, if you dare to challenge the system, the consequences are now absolute. The final line from our contact's message is the one that freezes the blood. And sometimes, he wrote, they shoot. The wall is not a passive barrier, it is an active, lethal weapon. In late August, a young man named Gunther Litvin was shot and killed while trying to swim across the Humboldt harbor. His was the first of what we fear will be many deaths. The threat is no longer imprisonment, it is execution. So how do people cope? How does the human spirit survive in such a suffocating environment? We are beginning to see the emergence of what sociologists are calling a niche society. People are retreating. They are turning their lives inward, focusing on the small, private spheres they can still control, their families, their allotment gardens, their hobbies. It is a form of internal emigration. Silent, subversive language is developing. In the state-approved theaters, an actor might give a certain line a particular emphasis that the audience understands as a critique of the regime. A poet might use metaphor to express a longing for freedom that would be forbidden if stated plainly. Art becomes a form of communication between the lines, a secret shared between the artist and the audience. In this grey world, the broadcasts from the West have become more vital than ever. Radios are turned down low and families huddle together to listen to RIAS, the radio in the American sector. Western television signals, which can be picked up in many parts of East Berlin, offer a flickering contraband window into another world. These signals are lifelines, a reminder that another reality exists beyond the wall. For the hundreds of thousands who had been planning to leave, the wall presents an impossible predicament. Their dream of a better life is now a crime. Republikflucht, flight from the Republic, is now prosecuted with a vengeance. Anyone caught even planning an escape can face years in a brutal political prison. The state has not only locked the door, it has criminalized the very act of wanting to leave. You can see the change in the faces of the people. The initial frantic panic of August has subsided. In its place, on many faces, is a look of dull, sullen resignation. It is the look of a people who have been told that their hopes do not matter, that their lives are not their own. It is the face of a city that has had its spirit forcibly sedated. And so we have two Berlins, now more different than ever before. In the West, there is noise, anger, protest, and a vibrant, if anxious, life. In the East, there is a pervasive, watchful quiet. The wall is not just a physical divider, it has become a psychological one, creating two distinct states of being. Two different ways of experiencing the world, separated by just a few feet of concrete. The story of those trapped in the East is one that is lived in whispers, in sideways glances, in things left unsaid. It is a story of quiet endurance against a backdrop of overwhelming power. Their cries for help are muted, their pleas for freedom swallowed by the silence that the wall enforces. It is our duty, as long as this broadcast can reach you, to listen for them. We cannot let their story be buried in the grey silence of oppression. We must be their voice. We must be the world's ears, listening for the heartbeat of defiance that still beats, however faintly, on the other side. Don't let our desperate cries for freedom fade into silence. Let the regime know the world is listening. Hit that subscribe button. Good evening. You are listening to Echoes from the Edge, your broadcast from a city that has become the world's most dangerous stage. The wall, a raw, ugly scar of concrete and wire, is now a fact of our lives. The escapes have slowed to a trickle. The families are broken. The silence in the East is deafening. But the tension, far from receding, has coalesced. It has found a focal point, a single street crossing where the fate of our city, and perhaps the world, now hangs in the balance. This is the chapter we call Checkpoint Charlie, a face-off in the streets. Checkpoint Charlie. The name sounds almost innocuous, like a character from a cheap spy novel. In reality, it is little more than a wooden shack on Friedrichstrasse, the main crossing point for Allied military personnel, diplomats, and foreign visitors entering the Soviet sector. It is one of the few remaining official scenes in the Iron Curtain, a place of procedure and protocol. But in the tense autumn of 1961, it has become a symbol of a dispute that threatens to plunge us all into darkness. The root of the crisis lies in the post-war agreements that guaranteed the Western Allies, the Americans, British and French, unfettered access to all sectors of Berlin. This was a fundamental right, a cornerstone of the city's fragile four-power status. But since the construction of the wall, the East German authorities, emboldened by their concrete success, have begun to chip away at this right, testing the resolve of the West. The spark was lit on the 22nd of October. A senior American diplomat, E. Allen Leitner, was attempting to cross Checkpoint Charlie in his official vehicle to attend an opera in East Berlin. He was stopped, not by Soviet officers, but by East German VOPO guards who demanded to see his passport. This was a deliberate provocation, a violation of established protocol. This was never about one man's trip to the theater. It was a profound matter of principle. For an American official to show his passport to East German police would be a tacit admission that they, and not the Soviets, had sovereign control over East Berlin. It would legitimize the East German state and undermine the entire legal framework of the four-power occupation. Leitner, understanding the gravity of the situation, refused. The American response was swift and unambiguous. A short time later, Leitner returned to the checkpoint. This time his car was flanked by a military escort, jeeps filled with armed American soldiers. With bayonets fixed, they escorted the diplomat across the border and back. The message was clear. American rights in Berlin were not negotiable and would be backed by force if necessary. But the East Germans, likely at the direction of their Soviet masters, continued to push. The next day, the provocations continued. It became a dangerous game of geopolitical chicken, played out with armed guards and diplomatic vehicles on a narrow city street. The world began to watch, sensing that this was more than a local dispute. It was a direct test of wills between the two superpowers. The stakes were raised considerably by the presence of one man, General Lucius D. Clay. A hero of the Berlin airlift, Clay had been personally sent by President Kennedy to reinforce the American position. He was a known hardliner, a man who had faced down Stalin once before and was not inclined to back down from his proxies. His presence signaled that the United States was prepared to escalate. And escalate it did. On General Clay's orders, the rumbling started. 10 American M48 Patton tanks, behemoths of steel and firepower, moved down Friedrichstrasse. They took up positions at Checkpoint Charlie, their engines idling with a low guttural growl, their long cannons pointing east. The dispute had now moved beyond jeeps and soldiers. This was a show of overwhelming force. The crisis had entered a new, terrifying phase. The world held its breath, and soon the response came. The Soviets could not allow this American show of force to go unanswered. From the eastern end of Friedrichstrasse, we heard a similar, terrifying rumble. 10 Soviet T-55 tanks, equal in power and menace, rolled into position, stopping just 100 yards from their American counterparts. A journalist standing near me described the scene with a perfect, chilling metaphor. "Tanks," he said, his voice barely a whisper. American on one side, Soviet on the other, face to face. The sight was surreal, a scene of raw power and primal aggression played out in the heart of a European capital. These were not props in a film. They were 32-ton killing machines, their barrels aimed directly at each other, their crews inside awaiting orders. The air grew thick with the smell of diesel fumes and palpable fear. My colleague looked on, shaking his head. "Like 2 very angry metal elephants," he murmured. And he was right. They stood there, immense, grey, and utterly menacing, the 2 most powerful military forces on the planet, squared off over a painted white line on a city street. The tension was no longer just local, it was global. This was not about Berlin anymore. This was about Washington versus Moscow. It was about NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. It was about the credibility of 2 empires, and we were standing on the fault line. Looming over this entire spectacle was the unspoken, terrifying reality of the nuclear age. Both of these superpowers possessed arsenals of atomic weapons capable of destroying human civilization many times over. A single shot fired here, a miscalculation, a nervous commander, any of it could trigger a chain of events that could lead directly to a full-scale nuclear exchange. The stakes were not victory or defeat, they were survival or annihilation. "We just stood there watching," my colleague confessed, capturing the feeling of utter helplessness that gripped us all, hoping someone remembered not to press the big red button, or the little red button for that matter. We, the citizens of Berlin, the reporters, the low-level soldiers, were merely spectators to a drama that could determine the fate of all humanity. We could only watch and pray that the men in charge in Washington and Moscow were rational, were calm, were wise. For 16 agonizing hours, the world teetered on the brink. From the afternoon of October 27th into the cool morning of the 28th, the tanks remained. Their engines idled, a constant low growl that was the soundtrack to our collective anxiety. The crews sat inside their steel coffins, waiting. It was a standoff of pure, concentrated nerve. The atmosphere was unlike anything I have ever experienced. It was not the loud chaos of battle. It was a tense, profound quiet, punctuated only by the hum of the tank engines, the crackle of military radios, and the shuffling feet of the silent crowds held back by police lines on either side. It was the quiet of a world holding its breath, afraid that the slightest noise might set off the explosion. But while the soldiers and tanks were locked in their silent confrontation, a frantic, high-stakes conversation was taking place thousands of miles away. A secret back channel had been opened between the Kennedy administration and the Kremlin. President Kennedy's brother, the Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, was in communication with a trusted Soviet intelligence officer. They were searching for a way out, a way for both sides to de-escalate without losing face. And then a deal was struck. An understanding was reached in the quiet corridors of power, far from the diesel-fumed air of Friedrichstrasse. The Soviets would pull their tanks back first, a small but significant concession. The Americans would then reciprocate. The core issue would be resolved with a typical diplomatic compromise. Allied officials would still not have to show their passports to East Germans, but they might discreetly show their identity cards to Soviet officers, if requested, upon entering the eastern sector. In the late morning of October 28th, it happened. The engine of one of the Soviet tanks revved, louder this time. A puff of black smoke shot from its exhaust. For a heart-stopping moment, no one knew which way it would move, and then, slowly, ponderously, it began to reverse, pulling back from the line. A collective sigh of relief, audible and profound, went through the crowd on the western side. Minutes later, an American tank followed suit. Its engine roared and it too pulled back from the checkpoint. One by one, in a carefully choreographed retreat, the metal elephants backed away from their confrontation. The immediate crisis was over. The world had stepped back from the abyss. What was the ultimate result of this terrifying face-off? In the end, the wall remained. The division of our city was, if anything, more firmly cemented, but a fragile status quo had been restored. The Soviets had subtly reasserted that they were the ultimate authority in the East, and the Americans had made it clear that they would use force to protect their rights in the West. But the standoff was a terrifyingly clear lesson for both superpowers. It was a glimpse into the terrible abyss of accidental nuclear war. The crisis highlighted the desperate need for more direct and reliable communication between Washington and Moscow, a lesson that would be brutally reinforced during the Cuban Missile Crisis the following year. The famous Moscow-Washington hotline would be a direct consequence of these near disasters. For us, the people of Berlin, the standoff confirmed our unenviable reality. We are the inhabitants of the world's premier flashpoint. Our city is the stage upon which the great powers play out their most dangerous dramas. The global conflict is not an abstract thing for us. It is a line of tanks at the end of our street. We stood at the brink of Armageddon and looked directly into the abyss, and for 16 terrifying hours the abyss stared back. This is the reality of our divided city, a place of constant, nerve-shredding tension. To hear more stories from the precipice, to truly understand how close we all came to the end, you need to be subscribed to this broadcast. Don't let the lessons of the brink fade into history. Subscribe now, and keep listening. Good evening. You are listening to Echoes from the Edge. The tanks at Checkpoint Charlie may have pulled back, their engines falling silent, but do not be mistaken. The battle for Berlin rages on. It has simply shifted from the streets to the airwaves, from the realm of steel to the realm of the mind. A new war is being fought now, a war of words, of narratives, of competing realities. And we, all of us, are the soldiers and the territory. This is the chapter we call the propaganda war, words as weapons. In this new war, the first and most important casualty is the truth. The concrete and wire that rips through our city is a physical fact, but its meaning is now furiously contested. On one side it is presented as a noble act of self-preservation, on the other it is decried as a monstrous crime against humanity. The very same object is given two entirely different names, and in that naming, a battle for the soul of the city is waged. The masters of the German Democratic Republic have given their creation a name of breathtaking Orwellian audacity. A colleague of mine, a weary veteran of these semantic battles, put it best. They call it an anti-fascist protective rampart, he said, the cynical quote marks audible in his voice. They insist they are protecting their socialist paradise from the corrupting influence of Western spies, saboteurs, and a resurgent Nazism. We, on the other hand, have a simpler, more honest name for it. We call it a prison wall. My colleague shook his head in a kind of weary wonder. Funny how a few words can change the meaning of a concrete barrier, he mused. And that is the heart of the matter. The East German state is engaged in a massive effort of political alchemy, trying to transmute the base metal of oppression into the gold of heroic defense. If they can control the language used to describe the wall, they hope they can control how their people and the world think about it. This is why this war of words is so critical. As my colleague concluded, a well-chosen phrase is almost as powerful as a tank sometimes. A tank can enforce compliance through fear of immediate violence, but words, if they take root, can shape belief, legitimize power, and manufacture consent. A tank can control your body, but a successful propaganda campaign can conquer your mind. The GDR's media machine is a formidable, monolithic entity. The official party newspaper, Neues Deutschland, the state television station, Deutscher Fernsehfunk, and the state radio broadcasts all speak with a single, synchronized voice. There is no dissent, no alternative viewpoint. Every broadcast, every article is meticulously crafted to reinforce the state's narrative. At the core of this narrative is a carefully constructed Feindbild, an enemy image. The West, and particularly West Berlin, is portrayed as a swamp of decadence, militarism, and revanchism. We are, according to their media, the agents of American imperialism, plotting the downfall of the first German workers' and peasants' state. The wall, therefore, is not an act of aggression, but a necessary act of quarantine against a deadly disease. This indoctrination is aimed most intensely at the young. In the schools and through the mandatory Free German Youth Organization, children are taught to see the wall as a source of pride. They are told stories of brave border guards protecting them from Western aggressors. They are encouraged to participate in rallies celebrating this great achievement, a generation being raised to see their prison walls as a protective embrace. But this information war is not a one-sided affair. From the island of West Berlin, we are fighting back with the most powerful weapon at our disposal, the truth. And our primary artillery piece in this battle is a radio station housed in the American sector, a station whose signal penetrates deep into the East, a station known to all as REIS. RISE, the radio in the American sector, is more than just a broadcaster. It is a lifeline. It is a daily, hourly refutation of the lies peddled by the East German state. Its news programs offer uncensored reports on world events and, crucially, on what is truly happening within the GDR itself. It is the voice of the free world, and for millions in the East it is the only alternative truth they can access. Just as the East has named the wall a protective rampart, we in the West have given it our own name, the Schandmauer, the Wall of Shame. This term, popularized by our mayor, Willy Brandt, and broadcast constantly on RIAS, frames the barrier not as a defensive structure, but as a monument to the moral bankruptcy of the regime that built it. It is a name that sticks because it resonates with the reality of what people see and feel. Our propaganda is not limited to the airwaves, it is a visual assault as well. All along the western side of the wall, viewing platforms have been erected, allowing citizens and the world's media to gaze into the workers' paradise and see the watchtowers and the death strip for themselves. We set up giant loudspeakers to broadcast news bulletins across the barriers. We hold up the front pages of our newspapers, their bold headlines screaming the truth for the guards on the other side to see. Mayor Willy Brandt has become the moral voice of our city's defiance. His powerful speeches, filled with righteous anger and profound empathy for the families torn apart, are broadcast on RIAS and have made him a symbol of resistance. He articulates the feelings of all Berliners, giving voice to our collective grief and our refusal to accept this monstrous reality as permanent. This war is fought over every single word. When people flee the East, we call them Flüchtlinge, refugees. The East calls them Grenzverletzer and Durata, border violators and traitors. We call their escape a flight to freedom. The East calls it Menschenhandel, human trafficking, claiming they were lured and sold by Western agents. Every choice of noun and verb is a political act, a volley in the information war. The GDR regime does not tolerate this intrusion into their closed society. They have invested heavily in a technological war against our broadcasts. They build powerful jamming stations that emit a cacophony of noise, attempting to drown out the signal of RIAS. But it is a difficult game for them to win. Our engineers are constantly finding new frequencies, and the desire of the people in the East to hear the truth is a powerful motivator for them to fiddle with their dials, seeking a clear signal through the static. Ultimately, the West's most potent weapon is the simple, unvarnished truth of the human experience. Rias reads the names of those arrested by the Stasi. It broadcasts interviews with recent escapees who describe the grim reality of life in the East. It plays the frantic, tearful messages recorded by family members in the West, hoping their loved ones on the other side might be listening. These personal stories are more powerful than any abstract ideological slogan. For an East Berliner, the simple act of tuning into REAS is an act of defiance. It is a secret, personal rebellion against the state's attempt to control their mind. To listen to a jazz program is to reject the state's sterile cultural norms. To hear an uncensored news report is to reclaim a piece of your own mind. It is a small but profound act of freedom in a world where all other freedoms have been extinguished. The great weakness of the East German propaganda is that it is built on a foundation of lies that contradicts the lived experience of its people. They can be told the economy is thriving, but they see the shortages in the shops. They can be told their families in the West are dangerous fascists, but they remember them as loving parents, siblings, and children. This gaping credibility gap breeds a deep and corrosive cynicism. This cynicism is the dominant mood in the East. People may not openly embrace the Western narrative, but they certainly do not believe their own governments. They learn to read between the lines of Neues Deutschland. They listen to the official pronouncements with a weary sense of derision. The propaganda does not create true believers, it creates a nation of internal exiles. In the end, the wall itself is the GDR's greatest propaganda failure. Its very existence is the most powerful argument against the state's claims of success. A paradise does not need to be surrounded by a prison wall. A government beloved by its people does not need to shoot them to prevent them from leaving. The wall is a daily, concrete admission of failure. And so, here in the autumn of 1961, the information war has reached a stalemate. The regime in the East can control what is printed and what is shown on its state television. It can dominate the public space with its banners and slogans, but it cannot seal the airwaves. It cannot stop the truth from seeping through the cracks. And we in the West can broadcast that truth, but our words cannot, as of yet, tear down the physical wall. In this war, the ultimate arbiter is the individual listener, the person huddled over their radio in a darkened room in East Berlin. They are forced to live in a state of cognitive dissonance, navigating two irreconcilable realities. Their mind is the battlefield, and the prize is their soul. This war will not be won with a single decisive battle. It will be a long, grinding war of attrition, fought day by day, broadcast by broadcast, headline by headline. It is a struggle to keep hope alive, to keep the idea of another reality from being extinguished by the suffocating blanket of state propaganda. Our broadcast, Echoes from the Edge, is a part of this struggle. We believe that broadcasting the truth, telling these stories, is an act of resistance. Every report we file, every interview we conduct, is a volley in this ongoing information war. We are soldiers armed not with rifles, but with microphones. And we need you. We need you to be more than a passive listener. We need you to be a part of this effort. Every subscriber to this broadcast is another soldier for the truth, another signal boost that cuts through the jamming. Support our ongoing information war. Don't let the truth be silenced. Subscribe now. Good evening. You're listening to Echoes from the Edge. The wall stands, a grim, grey, and seemingly insurmountable fact of our new reality. The windows of opportunity on the Bernauer Strasse have been bricked over. The border guards are more numerous, their gaze more intense. The state has declared its prison complete, but they have made a critical miscalculation. They have caged the body, but they have forgotten about the boundless, defiant ingenuity of the human mind. A new chapter of defiance is dawning. This is the chapter we call Tunnelers and Tricksters, the ingenuity of escape. The failure of open, head-on confrontation has forced a radical shift in strategy. The era of desperate leaps and chaotic protests is over. It was brave, but it was unsustainable. Now, a new kind of courage is required. It is the courage of stealth, of meticulous planning, of immense patience, and of breathtaking audacity. If you cannot go over the wall, and you cannot go through it, then you must find a third way. A contact of mine, a man who documents these things with a mixture of journalistic rigor and sheer amazement, put it to me this way: people are getting creative. This is not the creativity of an artist painting a canvas. This is the creativity of a prisoner forging a key. It is creativity born not of inspiration but of absolute, life-or-death necessity. The desire for freedom, it turns out, is the mother of some truly astonishing inventions. Before the more elaborate schemes took root, the first new attempts were often acts of brute force, but with a clever twist. We've all heard the story of the Austrian mechanic Heinz Meixner. In May of 1963, he rented a low Austin Healey Sprite sports car, removed the windshield, and drove it, with his mother-in-law ducking in the trunk, at full speed under the crossbar of a Czech. A simple, brutal, and brilliant solution. My contact's observation rings true. Even driving a truck through a flimsy barrier, he noted, was an early tactic. In the first months, before the checkpoints were heavily fortified with concrete bollards and zigzagging traps, several people simply crashed heavy vehicles through the gates. Of course, with each successful breach, the East German regime learned, adapted, and reinforced, forcing the escapees to become ever more cunning. And so the people of Berlin began to look down. Beneath the streets, beneath the watchtowers, beneath the death strip itself, lies a new frontier, the soft, sandy soil of the North German plain. The ground beneath our feet has become the newest battlefield in the Cold War. The great era of the tunnelers has begun. Digging a tunnel under the Berlin Wall is an enterprise fraught with unimaginable peril. The soil is sandy and prone to collapse. The city's water table is high, meaning a constant threat of flooding. Lack of oxygen in a narrow, unventilated shaft can be lethal. And above all, there is the constant gnawing fear of discovery. The Stasi have informants everywhere, and they are beginning to deploy seismic sensors to detect vibrations from digging. And yet, they dig. Students, factory workers, doctors, engineers, people from all walks of life are becoming subterranean architects. As my friend noted, turns out human desperation is an excellent engineer. These are amateurs, learning as they go, overcoming incredible obstacles with sheer grit and ingenuity. They are not just digging through sand, they are digging through fear. What does one of these tunnels look like? They almost always begin in the basement or cellar of a building close to the wall. The tools are laughably primitive: garden shovels, old buckets, sometimes just their bare hands. One of the greatest challenges is how to dispose of hundreds of cubic feet of excavated soil without arousing the suspicion of neighbors or the ever-present Stasi informants. The dirt is sometimes hidden in attics, flushed down toilets, or carried out, bag by painstaking bag, under the cover of darkness. We are already hearing whispers of astonishingly ambitious projects. Rumors are circulating about a group of students from the West who are digging a tunnel back into the East to rescue friends and strangers. These operations require incredible coordination. Teams of diggers working in shifts, lookouts watching the border guards, people managing logistics, and a system for getting the escapees to the tunnel entrance at the precise moment. The level of trust required is immense. A single traitor, a single careless word, can doom the entire project and send dozens of people to prison. Yet, these conspiracies of hope are forming, built on a foundation of shared desperation and a profound faith in one's fellow man. It is a testament to the fact that even in a state built on paranoia, trust can still find a way to flourish in the shadows. And with every successful escape, the East German state suffers a humiliating defeat. My contact summed it up with a wry smile. And a very bad accountant for the East German state, he added. Every person who escapes is not just a soul set free. They are a lost worker, a lost taxpayer, a lost soldier. Every escapee is a debit on the GDR's balance sheet of legitimacy, a tangible piece of evidence that their system is a failure. But the ingenuity is not confined to the subterranean world. Above ground, the tricksters are at work, particularly with vehicles. We are hearing incredible stories of cars being modified in secret workshops. false floors, hollowed-out dashboards, hidden compartments welded into gas tanks, all designed to smuggle a person through the intense scrutiny of a checkpoint inspection. One of the most charmingly audacious stories is that of the BMW Isetta. The tiny, Italian-designed bubble car, barely big enough for two, seems the most unlikely of escape vehicles. Yet a clever mechanic in the West modified one, removing the heating system and other components to create a tiny, secret compartment behind the dashboard, just large enough for a person to squeeze into. It made several successful trips, its unassuming size the perfect disguise. Beyond the mechanical, there is a kind of theatrical trickery. We've heard reports of people being sewn into large bolts of fabric, loaded onto trucks as cargo. There are stories of people hiding in cow carcasses being transported to the West. The creativity is boundless, a madcap collection of schemes that would be comical if the consequences of failure were not so dire. And some, in their desperation, are beginning to look upwards. They see the wall, they see the guards, they see the dogs and the wire, and they dream of simply floating over it all. The idea is so simple, so audacious, it borders on fantasy. To build a machine that can carry you up and over the death strip, using nothing but the basic laws of physics. My contact mentioned it almost as an aside, a testament to the incredible rumors that now circulate. Hot air balloons stitched from bedsheets, he said, and we both paused to consider the image. The sheer, breathtaking bravery of it. To trust your life and the lives of your family to a patchwork of fabric and a cylinder of propane gas, to rise silently into the night sky. A perfect target for every border guard below. That reality may still be years away, but the dream is being born now, in the hearts of the trapped. It is important to remember that many of these escapes, especially the complex tunnels, are not possible without help from the West. University students in West Berlin are at the forefront, raising money, procuring tools, providing false documents, and arranging for safe houses for the escapees once they emerge, covered in mud and gasping, into the free world. It is an international collaborative effort of defiance. But the Stasi and the border guards are fighting back with all the resources of the state. They are perfecting their methods of detection. The death strip is being expanded, raked with sand to show footprints, tripwires, alarms, and eventually landmines and automated firing systems will make the border an even more formidable death trap. This is a constant evolving arms race between the ingenuity of the escapee and the brutality of the state. And failure is catastrophic. For every triumphant story we hear, there are dozens of heartbreaking failures. Tunnels that flood just meters from their goal. Escape plans betrayed by an informant for a few extra marks or a promotion at work. The despair of being caught so close to freedom is a unique and terrible form of torture. For those who are caught, the consequences are swift and severe. The crime of Republikflucht, attempting to flee the Republic, carries a heavy prison sentence. The accused are sent to notorious political prisons, like Hohenschönhausen in East Berlin, where they face years of brutal interrogation, isolation, and psychological torment. Even for those who succeed, the psychological weight is immense. The months spent digging in secret, the constant fear of a knock on the door, the claustrophobic terror of being deep underground, the final heart-stopping dash to freedom, these experiences leave deep and lasting scars. Freedom is won, but it comes at a profound personal cost. Yet, every single successful escape is a dagger in the heart of the East German regime. It is a powerful propaganda victory for the West, a story that we can broadcast back into the East on REAs, a story that proves the wall is not invincible and that the state is not omnipotent. Every escapee is a living testament to the failure of their system. What we are witnessing is a powerful testament to the human spirit. The state builds a wall, so the people dig a tunnel. The state reinforces a checkpoint, so the people build a car with a secret compartment. The state builds a higher fence, so the people dream of flying over it. The drive to be free cannot be contained by concrete or wire. Here, in the final months of 1961 and the dawn of 1962, this story of incredible escapes is just beginning. The legends of the tunnelers, the tricksters, and the daredevils are being written now in the dark cellars and secret workshops of a divided city. Their stories will be told for generations to come. Every escape attempt is a real-life thriller, every success a testament to breathtaking courage. If you are finding these tales of ingenuity as thrilling as we are, if you are on the edge of your seat listening to the lengths people will go to for their freedom, then we ask for your support. Please subscribe for more. You will not want to miss what they think of next. Good evening. You are listening to Echoes from the Edge. We have spoken of the ingenuity of the escapees, of the tunnels and the trickery. It is a story of hope and human spirit. But for every action there is a reaction, and the reaction of the East German state to this defiance has been to escalate its brutality to the ultimate degree. The wall was built to be a barrier. It is now being transformed into a hunting ground. Tonight, we speak of the unspeakable. This is the chapter we call The Guards and the Guns, Death at the Border. For the first few weeks after the 13th of August, the wall was a barrier of concrete, wire, and intimidation. It was a prison wall, but the sentence was life, not death. That all changed on the 24th of August 1961. A 24-year-old tailor named Günther Litvin, attempting to swim to freedom across the Humboldt harbor near the Charité Hospital, was spotted by transport police. Without warning, they opened fire. He was killed instantly. The first shot had been fired. The wall had claimed its first life by bullet. That single act changed everything. A line had been crossed, not just on the map, but a moral line. The East German state had declared that the crime of Republikflucht, of wanting to leave, was now punishable by summary execution, without trial, without appeal. The wall was no longer just a prison. It was a potential death sentence for anyone who dared to challenge it. The official report from the East German news agency was sickening in its bureaucratic cruelty. They did not name Günther Litvin. He was referred to simply as a criminal border violator. His death was not a tragedy. It was a successful police action. This is the language of tyranny, the dehumanization of the victim to justify the atrocity. By stripping him of his name, they sought to strip him of his humanity. But what of the men who pull the triggers? A contact on the other side, a man who has observed them for weeks from his apartment window, shared a haunting observation. The guards, he wrote in a smuggled note, young men mostly, some looked just as scared as the people they're aiming at. They are not for the most part monsters. They are boys, conscripts, often from small towns, who have been thrust onto this terrible front line. These young men are trapped in an impossible system. They are acting under what is known as the Schießbefehl, the order to shoot. It is an unwritten law, a standing order passed down the chain of command. No one gets through. You are to stop any attempted escape, using any means necessary up to and including lethal force. To hesitate, to let someone escape, is to risk severe punishment yourself. You could be court-martialed, imprisoned, branded a traitor. Imagine the moral torment of that moment. You are 20 years old. You see a figure, perhaps someone your own age, making a desperate run for the wire. Your officer is screaming in your ear to open fire. Your own survival and future depend on your obedience. But your conscience, your basic human decency, screams at you to lower the rifle. It is a dilemma designed by hell itself. But the system is designed to crush that conscience. The indoctrination is relentless. The fear of punishment is absolute. And so, as my contact wrote with a profound sense of tragedy, but they shoot. They have to. The system overrides the individual. The gun is fired, a life is extinguished. The young guard is trapped on his side of the wall, now bound to the regime by an act of violence. To facilitate this lethal policy, the border itself has been transformed. It is no longer just a wall, it is a meticulously engineered killing zone. On the eastern side, a wide death strip has been cleared. Buildings have been demolished to create an open field of fire. The ground is covered in soft sand or gravel, a control strip that betrays every footprint. The watchtowers have become the dominant feature of this new landscape. They rise every few hundred yards, concrete pillars of state-sponsored terror. Inside, guards with powerful binoculars scan the death strip day and night. They are equipped with rifles and machine guns. They are the eyes of the state, and their towers are the sniper nests from which death is dispensed. We in the West now live with a constant gnawing fear. We fear a day will come when someone is not killed instantly by a clean shot. We fear a day when someone is merely wounded in that terrible no man's land, left to bleed to death while the world watches, powerless to help. The cruelty of the wall has the potential to reach depths we have not yet even imagined. When a death occurs, the propaganda machine of the East kicks into high gear. The victim is always blamed. They were a criminal, a traitor, a tool of Western provocateurs. The official newspapers print stories lamenting how Western agents lured this poor misguided soul to their tragic but necessary end. It is a grotesque inversion of reality, where the murderer poses as the lamenting guardian. On our side of the wall, the response is one of impotent rage. When a shot rings out, crowds gather. They scream at the guards in the watchtowers, their voices roar with fury and grief. Murder! 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 Murderers! The cry echoes across the death strip. But a shout cannot stop a bullet. The rage of the free is no match for the rifles of the state. Our role in the Western media, and the role of the West Berlin police, has become one of bearing witness. We document every death. We try to identify the victims, to find their families, to tell their stories. We fight to give them back the names and the humanity that the East German state tries to erase. We broadcast their stories so the world does not forget. And so another grim ritual has become part of our lives. A shooting happens. The official reports are silent or misleading, and then, slowly, through whispers and contacts, the news seeps across the border. And then, there's another name whispered, my contact wrote. Another name added to the growing list of the dead. Another family in the East told that their son or daughter died in a tragic accident. Each death is the ultimate fulfillment of the wall's purpose, the breaking of families, made permanent and irreversible. A mother who will never see her son again. A wife who is now a widow. Children who are now orphans. The wall does not just separate families, it now destroys them with an awful finality. My colleague's final thought on the matter hangs in the air every time another shot is fired. For a wall, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of it all, it's quite the legacy. A legacy written in blood and concrete. A monument to a political system that must kill its own citizens to prove its legitimacy. We have received reports, difficult to confirm but persistent, that the guards who successfully kill an escapee are rewarded. They are given special leave, a bonus in their pay, sometimes even a medal. The state is not just compelling its soldiers to kill, it is actively incentivizing it, celebrating it, institutionalizing murder as a patriotic act. But this system is not without its cracks. We also hear the stories of the border guards who cannot bear it. There have been several documented cases of guards using their specialized knowledge of the border fortifications to make their own desperate escape to the West. They are the ones for whom the moral dilemma became too much, who chose their conscience over the commands of the state. And even for those who stay, for those who follow their orders, the psychological toll is immense. We hear reports of rampant alcoholism among the border troops, of nervous breakdowns, of suicides. A system that forces young men to become killers ultimately damages them as well. The brutality of the wall scars both the hunted and the hunter. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this new reality is how quickly the horror risks becoming normal. The first shooting was a profound shock to the system. The 10th, the 20th, does each one shock us a little less? This is the great danger, that the world will grow accustomed to the sight of a wall where people are shot down like animals. We cannot let that happen. The list of victims is a litany of lost potential. They are not abstract political martyrs. They were construction workers, students, mothers, young lovers. They were people who simply wanted a different life, a life of choice, a life without fear. They died because that simple human desire was a crime in the state in which they were born. The lethal enforcement has stripped away the last of the East's propaganda. The wall is not an anti-fascist protective rampart. That lie has been shot to pieces along with its victims. Its true purpose is now laid bare for all the world to see. It is a weapon of terror, designed to control a population through the most basic and brutal of all instruments, the fear of a violent death. And so, as we look out from our divided city in the final months of 1961, we are faced with an unending, agonizing question. How many more? How many more names will be whispered across the border? How many more families will be permanently broken? The future from here looks dark and stained with blood. These stories, these names, these grim lessons are written in blood on a concrete wall. To allow them to be forgotten is to dishonor the victims and to grant a victory to their killers. To understand the ultimate price of tyranny, the world must be reminded of the human cost of this barrier. Keep the grim lessons coming. Like this broadcast, subscribe to our channel, and help us bear witness. Good evening. You are listening to Echoes from the Edge. The wall has stood for months now. The initial shock, the raw, screaming wound of August, has begun to scar over. The tanks have retreated. The desperate leaps from windows have ceased. The world's attention has begun to wander, and in its place a strange and unsettling quiet has descended. A city is learning to live with its amputation. This is the story of that surreal adjustment. This is the chapter we call Life Goes On. Sort of. The journalist I spoke with, a man who has seen more than his share of this city's tragedies, tried to put it into words. Life continues, he said, gesturing to a street where trams were running and people were heading home from work. People go to work, the trams still run, but it's different, like a body that's lost a limb. That image has stayed with me. Berlin is a phantom limb city. The city's basic functions carry on. The factories in the east still produce goods, the shops in the west still sell them, but the amputation is undeniable. A whole half of the city's circulatory system has been tied off. The phantom pain of what was lost is a constant throbbing ache. It is the pain of a street that now abruptly ends in a wall of concrete. It is the pain of a telephone that will no longer connect to a number just a few miles away. You learn to live without it, my friend continued, but the phantom pain is always there. That pain is in the empty chair at the family dinner table. It is in the silence where a friend's laughter used to be. It is in the subconscious turn of the head you make, expecting to see a landmark that is now on the other side of an impassable barrier. It is a daily haunting. This haunting has rewired the very map of our city. The S-Bahn and U-Bahn networks, once a unified web connecting every corner of Berlin, have been violently severed. Western trains now travel through Geisterbahnhofe, ghost stations in the east. They slow down, but they do not stop, passing dimly lit platforms guarded by armed vopos, silent tombs where no passenger has alighted since August. The wall itself is transforming from a shocking intrusion into a permanent feature of the landscape. It is becoming a landmark. People have started giving directions in relation to it. Go down the street until you hit the wall, then take the last right. It is a point of reference, a grim north star of our division, as mundane and as monstrous as a mountain range that has sprung up overnight. My friend, the journalist, let out a long, slow sigh. A very, very large phantom pain, he concluded, and that is the scale of it. This is not the loss of a finger, but the loss of half the body. Millions of connections, familial, professional, social, were severed in a single night. The city's soul has been cleaved in two, and we are now just two halves, learning to function independently. And the two halves are adapting in profoundly different ways. In the West, it is an adaptation of defiance, a loud and sometimes angry refusal to accept the new reality. In the East, it is an adaptation of sullen, silent submission, a retreat into the private sphere where some small sliver of personal freedom can be maintained. Two cities bearing the same name are now developing two entirely different personalities. The economic disruption was immediate. West Berlin lost nearly 50,000 skilled workers, the Grenzgänger, who lived in the east but fueled the Western economy. Industries are scrambling to replace them. The East, meanwhile, has to absorb a workforce that is now trapped, a captive pool of labor for its struggling planned economy. The economic divorce is as brutal as the personal one. Here in the West, a political decision has been made. West Berlin must survive. It must be made into a glittering showcase of the West, a vibrant and prosperous symbol of capitalism's superiority, staring defiantly across the wall. This means the city is now an island on life support, heavily subsidized by West Germany and the Allied powers. This has fostered a unique culture of defiance. The western face of the wall is becoming a canvas for protest, the first angry scrawls of graffiti appearing like sores on its grey skin. The viewing platforms, once temporary, are being reinforced, becoming permanent installations. They are a place for tourists, yes, but also for Berliners to stand and stare, a ritual of remembrance and refusal. To keep the city alive, a system of incentives has been created. The Berlin Zuläge, the Berlin bonus, provides tax breaks and supplements to salaries for those who choose to live and work here. We are, in effect, being paid to be defiant, paid to live on the front line of the Cold War. Our very presence is a political statement. The viewing platforms are a perfect symbol of our new normal. From these perches, we look over the wall into the silent grey world of the death strip. It is a strange, voyeuristic ritual. We are bearing witness, but we are also helpless. It is an act of solidarity that only reinforces our own separation, a way of remembering that actively reminds us of what we have lost. A kind of siege mentality is taking hold. We are an island in a Red Sea. The constant presence of American, British, and French soldiers on our streets is both a comfort and a constant unnerving reminder of our precarious position. We are free, but our freedom is fragile, protected by the military might of distant powers. Paradoxically, this isolation is fueling a new kind of creative energy. Cut off from its hinterland, West Berlin is becoming a magnet for artists, musicians, students, and nonconformists from all over West Germany. It is an edgy, intense, and vibrant place to be, its cultural life charged with the nervous energy of the front line. But even with this defiance, a psychological scar is forming in the West. There is a claustrophobia to life on an island. The wall may be on one side, but it surrounds us in spirit. There is a feeling of being trapped, albeit in a much larger, more comfortable cage than the one next door. We live in a state of constant tension, a struggle between the desire to live a normal life, to fall in love, to raise a family, to build a career, and the political duty to never, ever accept the wall as a normal state of affairs. We try to forget it in our daily lives, but we are compelled to remember it as our civic duty. In the East, the adaptation is quieter, more internalized. Publicly, life goes on. The state-run media declares the new normal a resounding success, a triumph of security and peace. The people, having no other choice, go to work, stand in queues, and keep their heads down. To do otherwise is to invite the attention of the Stasi. This has led to a mass retreat into the private sphere. Since public life is a stage for state propaganda, people are pouring their energies into the small corners they can still control, their little apartments, their allotment gardens or dachas on the outskirts of the city, their family circles. These have become the fortresses of the inner self. The physical character of East Berlin is changing. Without the competition and influence of the West, a certain grayness is setting in. The state is now embarking on massive new housing projects, the Plattenbaden, functional, prefabricated concrete slab buildings that are efficient but soulless. The city is becoming more orderly, more uniform, and less vibrant. The state, in its own way, is trying to create a new normal. It offers cradle-to-grave security, guaranteed employment, subsidized housing, free healthcare and education. It is a new kind of paternalism, an attempt to purchase the loyalty of its citizens, to trade freedom for a predictable, if drab, security. But this new normal in the East comes with the constant, chilling presence of the state. The watchtowers are the new church spires. The propaganda slogans are the new wallpaper. The fear of an informant is the new social etiquette. This fear is the price of the state's security. And here in the East, the phantom pain is sharper, more acute. They too have lost a limb, but they are the ones trapped inside the wounded body. They can hear our radio broadcasts. In some areas they can even receive our television signals, a flickering black and white window into a world they can no longer touch. This constant reminder of what has been lost is a unique form of daily torture. The humble tram is perhaps the best metaphor. In the West, it clatters noisily through a city that is anxious but alive, defiant and free. In the East, the same machine clatters through streets that are quiet, orderly and cowed. The mechanics are the same, but the worlds they traverse are now universes apart. The most profound scars of this new normal are the ones we cannot see. They are the psychological wounds, the broken trust between neighbors, the learned helplessness in the face of state power, the quiet, unexpressed grief for lost family and lost futures. This is the true, lasting legacy of the wall. It is a structure designed to break the spirit. It is a monumental shift, a change so profound that it is hard to fully grasp, even for those of us living through it. The body of our city is adapting, but its soul is still in a state of shock. If you are still processing this, if you want to continue to understand the deep and lasting human cost of this division, be sure to subscribe. Our story is far from over. And so, as the sun sets on another day in this divided city, this has been Klaus Richter, your humble and increasingly caffeinated broadcaster from Berlin, 1961. We've seen the bricks rise, felt the bite of barbed wire, and witnessed the agonizing reality of broken families. If this desperate, darkly humorous transmission from the very front lines of the Cold War has given you a moment of profound contemplation, or perhaps made you appreciate your own era's ability to simply cross the street, then my purpose is served. Keep listening, keep questioning, and for the sake of humanity, keep that subscribe button pressed. Because even when walls stand tall, the desire for freedom and the stories will always find a way to break through. Until the next broadcast, from somewhere less concrete perhaps. Auf Wiedersehen. Goodbye.